I once swore my life had ended that night in the muddy trenches of Monte Cassino back in 1944, when shellfire lit up the sky and the air smelled of dust and fear, and I lay there trembling in the mud, clutching a crumpled envelope, weathered, folded, bearing an address I had memorized like a promise, whispered to myself in quiet moments between the chaos. That address belonged to her, Rosa, with her floral bandana tied around her hair, the woman who hugged me tight at Grand Central Station before I boarded the troop train to Europe, saying, "I'll be here when you come back." Words I held onto more surely than the uniform I wore. But war has a hunger of its own. It devours letters, tears families apart, erases street names and memories. Months passed with no answer, and then years. When I finally returned to New York City, the world had changed. I had changed. The city wore its wounds like scars on old brick buildings and dusty sidewalks. People hardly spoke about what they lost because there was just too much to retell. But I still carried that envelope, and the last memory of her smile etched into my mind like a cherished photograph. Time never erased the sight of her hand waving goodbye, and that kept me believing she might still be out there. I arrived at the brownstone on East 66th Street late one afternoon. The street looked recognizable, though awnings were newer and neighbors' children played differently on stoops. The number matched, etched in pencil on that envelope I refused to throw away. The door, dark wood with a brass knob that had patina of age and history, sat quietly in the fading light. I reached out and hesitated, wondering if revisiting places might only bring grief, if hope was strong enough to open that door. My fingertips touched cold metal and I tapped once, then twice, with my heart pounding so loudly I thought the city would hear it. Silence answered me, and I realized it wasn't the door I feared, but the man I had become. I nearly turned to leave, ready to vanish into the crowd of strangers, but something in me held fast. Some trace of love buried in the noise of war and time. I stayed. I waited. Because if even a piece of that promise survived, I had to believe it could bloom again, even in the midst of ruins. If this story moves you as it moved me, drop a like and subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive. Stories that connect hearts, open old wounds tenderly, and remind us that even war cannot kill everything. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. I stepped off the subway onto the cracked platform of 86th Street, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it would echo against the aged tiles and startled the few late stragglers waiting for the last train, because every footstep forward felt like wading through a tide of memories that refused to stay buried under the rubble of war. And I wanted to hold on to those memories, to breathe them in, like the scent of fresh coffee beans wafting from a corner bodega, mixing with the distant aroma of roasted peanuts from street vendors. Yet I feared with every fiber of my being that those same memories would betray me, revealing how much I'd changed and how much everything I once knew had changed, even if the buildings still wore stoop chairs and painted iron railings that whispered of Sunday mornings and worn newspapers left behind by contented husbands. The traffic still roared on Lexington Avenue, familiar horns and tires on asphalt, creating a soundtrack I once believed would never change. And yet as I emerged onto the sidewalk, I felt smaller. In a city layered with millions of stories, mine had become just one more whisper in the wind, one more soul hoping to find something it lost. But the address scribbled on that aging envelope, 338 East 66th Street, blazed in my mind like a lighthouse guiding me back through decades of dust and distance, promising that somewhere behind a matching brown door was the answer to the question that haunted my every breath. Would she still be there, even if only in memory? I passed the corner newsstand, its blank newspaper boards stubbornly reflecting headlines I could no longer read, without recalling wartime alerts and blackout notices. And I thought of all the letters I'd handwritten to her in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. Pleas, confessions, declarations, and how none of them clearly expressed the ache of anticipation, the fear that if I didn't return she would disappear like smoke, and those words might never reach her. Now, after years of silence, I realized I had come not to reclaim the past, but to confront it. No, to understand it. Because I had survived the war only to discover that surviving did not automatically heal every wound. The brownstone came into view. 3 stories of red brick, framed by slender trees, just leafing out with spring's gentle promise. Stoop leading up to a heavy, dark wood door, crowned by a brass mail slot and an ornate knocker. Each detail so intimately familiar that my throat tightened, my knees weakened as I approached. I gingerly lifted the silver knocker, but not wanting to announce myself too boldly, I tapped once instead, lightly, then paused, hearing nothing but my own exhale reverberate through the hallway, and I tapped again, this time more firmly, each sound resonating within me like a question. "Is she still in there?" Silence answered. I readied myself to walk away, to accept that fate had cruelly moved her on. Yet another step toward anonymity in this sprawling city. But before I could turn, the door creaked open just enough to reveal a woman's silhouette, the outline of someone older, her hair pinned back in a low chignon, eyes widening in recognition or perhaps in disbelief, and I braced as if standing before the ghost of Ever, a thing I once loved, speechless until the words escaped me. I came looking for Rosa. My voice cracked, betraying years of quiet longing, and my palms slicked with nervous sweat as I waited for whatever response would follow. The woman hesitated a moment, then stepped aside and said, her voice steady but gentle, "She's upstairs. I'm her sister, Emily. She wasn't sure you'd ever come back." Relief and dread intertwined inside me like fuel and flame, and I swallowed hard, nodding, allowing her to guide me past the small entryway into a living room hung with framed snapshots of family events I did not recognize. Weddings, graduations, holidays, all bridging the gap between the world I'd left and the one I'd returned to. But I walked through each photograph with reverence, as if seeking proof that some things endure even when the letters are lost and the years slip through our fingers. Emily led me into the kitchen. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, falling on formica counters littered with mismatched mugs and a half-full coffee pot, the aroma rich and bittersweet like memory. She poured me a cup and watched me cradle it between my hands, slow, deliberate, as though the warmth would anchor me to this reality. "Rosa's out in the garden," she said, her voice soft. "She'll be down soon." As I sipped, I felt my pulse steady, as though anchored by her assurance, yet dread coiled beneath each breath. What if, after all these years, the shape of her sadness was deeper than my desire? I glanced at my reflection in the window pane, grey strands in my hair, lines etched by worry and grief, but those eyes, too green and stubborn to hide the boy I'd never stopped being. I closed my eyes and felt a tremor in my chest, because I understood in that moment that I had returned not just for her, but for a self I feared was gone. And still I hoped to find him again, waiting behind the door labeled home. I sat on the wooden porch of 338 East 66th Street, the paint peeling gently in the soft afternoon sun, and watched the neighborhood carry on with its Sunday rituals. Neighbors chatting over low fences, mail carriers delivering bundles of letters and magazines, and children's laughter faintly echoing from behind hedges, all reminders of a world that had moved on while I remained suspended in time. Thinking about the last words I heard before being shipped overseas, and the ones I vowed I'd never forget, but maybe faded into the turmoil of war. Every crack in the step beneath me seemed to hold a memory of my fingers tracing that same grain years ago when I held my breath before boarding a troop train, of the sound of distant trains intermingled with the sharp snap of orders, and of Rosa's voice telling me to be brave before I disappeared into the chaos. Sundays here had once meant simplicity, paper spread across laps, coffee-warming hands, and soft exchanges before weekday lives resumed. Yet today, the sunlight that splashed across my sleeve felt unfamiliar, like a stranger's soft touch. I rose slowly, brushing dust from my trousers, and stepped inside the hallway, hearing the familiar squeak of the narrow staircase. Each step a note of a song I hadn't played for years, notes of home, warmth, and promise. The house smelled of fresh soap and old wood, and I took a deep breath, trying to breathe in the nostalgia before it rushed out in tears. I couldn't help but think of how many days I'd spent waiting for this moment. Yet now that I was here, I realized I had forgotten how to simply stand in the doorway without your palms sweating, without your heart threatening to bolt out your chest. I turned a corner and found myself standing before a photo of a younger couple on a mantelpiece. Possibly her younger version with her husband, maybe their wedding day, and I realized again that the place I remembered wasn't frozen in time. It had kept growing without me. Emily followed me through the living room, her footsteps soft, as though she didn't want to disturb my reverie. She stopped by the open French doors leading to the backyard garden and gestured wordlessly toward the flower beds. "She's out back," she whispered, and I nodded, lost for a moment in the way the light played across the petals of bright tulips and daffodils, colors dancing as if celebrating a return they might never have believed would happen. The garden was an intimate sanctuary, stones laid neatly along the pathways, benches tucked beneath arching branches, and an old wrought-iron table holding a watering can and a stack of terracotta pots. Every detail felt like a frame from a shared memory. Us, together, planting bulbs for spring, humming old jazz standards, dreaming of a life beyond what we'd seen. As I stepped onto the flagstones, I felt the earth below whispering history. The knot in my stomach loosened as I spotted her by the far fence, her hands covered in soil, planting a rose bush. The afternoon light outlined her silhouette so clearly that I swear I could see both the young girl who shook when I boarded the troop train and the woman who'd become stronger, wiser, tempered by everything she'd endured. I called her name softly, Rosa, and she paused, turning, the rose petals framing her like a curtain opening to the reveal of a performance. Time blurred in that moment. Her breath caught. Her shoulders tensed, and I knew she was listening not just with her ears, but with her entire heart, trying to decide whether she would walk toward me or shrink into the world she built without me. I closed the distance slowly, each step a silent prayer of reconciliation. She let the tools clatter to the ground and stood straight, wiping her hands on her apron before meeting my gaze. Her smile was cautious, unreadable, as if she was trying to chart the space between forgiveness and forgetfulness. I swallowed hard and said, "I wanted to tell you I'm sorry for everything, the silence, the fear, the not knowing, but mostly I wanted you to know I came back." My voice trembled, echoing in the hush of the garden, and I felt the years fall away when she whispered, "I hoped you would." We didn't hug, we didn't cry, at least not outwardly, but our eyes met, and I thought I saw her breathing steady, holding on to the moment before it fell apart under its own weight. We stood there together, reminded that life could fracture us and remake us, but it couldn't erase the simple truth of two hearts that mattered to each other. The scent of soil and flowers wrapped around us, and I realized what we had here was neither past nor future. It was this quiet bridge between what was lost and what might still be. Emily appeared at the door, as though remembering us in our moment, and offered more coffee. We nodded gratefully, and she retreated, leaving us to our renewal. We moved slowly back into the kitchen, where Rosa poured us both cups and set them on the soft, well-worn Formica countertop. I watched as her fingers brushed mine when she handed the cup, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, this was our geography now. Gentle proximity without pretense, shared warmth without pressure, forgiveness without forgetting. That afternoon, we sat facing one another, soft light cushioning our words. We spoke of her life after I left, how she learned patience and resilience, found small joys in quiet routines, and built a home in my absence. I spoke of survival, of nights lit by distant fires and cold dawns, wondering if any part of my old life was still waiting. We didn't solve everything, we just listened, and listening built a bridge wider than any love letter. When I finally looked up, I saw in her eyes the reflection of a future we could shape, not by erasing what happened, but by acknowledging how it shaped us. And in that reflection, I saw not regret, but possibility, an unexpected gift that neither war nor time could steal. The soft glow of evening light filtered through the kitchen window, illuminating the chipped formica countertop where Rosa and I sat, each holding a mug of lukewarm coffee that had grown quiet and calm, just like the space between us had grown more patient and aware after the afternoon's garden meeting. I watched the steam drift upward, swirling in lazy spirals, and thought that it resembled the shape of memories in my mind, some clear, others faint, but all intertwined with the scent of orange blossoms from the tree she planted. It struck me suddenly that war had stolen our words, but could not fully extinguish what remained unspoken. And as I inhaled, I felt that restoration was happening not through grand gestures, but in tiny ripples, the way her thumb brushed the rim of my mug, as though testing the warmth left in my hand, or the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her life after that final goodbye at the station years ago. She spoke first, recounting quiet triumphs, completing a degree at Hunter College before switching careers to work at a small publishing house, meeting friends who became family, renovating this brownstone room by room to make it more than a house. She made it a home. As she spoke, I felt both pride and regret. Pride that she had created strength in solitude, regret that I had missed all those quiet victories. I realized that my absence was not simply an empty space in her life, but a starting point for a different kind of resilience, one I had yet to fully comprehend. I cleared my throat and told her about returning to civilian life, working at the docks, struggling to find meaning in tasks that felt inconsequential compared to the fight for survival overseas, and how every night I stared at the ceiling, wishing time would heal me, but knowing that only connection would. Her nod told me she understood more than words could convey, that she had lived in parallel silence and survived it with determination. We ate a light supper that I had picked up from a diner half a block away, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and peas served in styrofoam to-go containers, warmed in her oven, filling the kitchen with a humble aroma that made the space feel real and lived in. I told her it tasted like hope, and she smiled, saying she liked that thought, liked the idea that simple things could become anchors when life feels untethered. The gentle jazz record I found on a shelf still played softly in the background, a song I once whistled along to on rainy nights when the city lights refracted on pavement and everything felt possible. It was as if the music remembered us too. It paused, waited for our eyes to meet, then resumed as though affirming our return. Later, I mentioned the photograph I had kept all these years. The one of us laughing on the shore of Long Island's Great South Bay during a summer break before deployment, the ocean pulling at our clothes, and me promising that I would bring her back seashells from every beach I visited. She reached across and touched the worn frame sitting on the table, gently brushing her fingertips over my face in the picture and then her own. Her voice cracked when she said she remembered that promise. I apologized again, that my letters never arrived, that I hadn't written enough, that I hadn't told her what she needed when it mattered most. But she shook her head and said I had given her something more essential, the truth of my return. As we talked, I noticed the daylight fading, and outside the window the city lights began to blink on one by one, like distant stars reminding us of the journey we'd both survived. I suggested we go for a walk, to revisit the stoop where she said goodbye, and where now, maybe, goodbye wouldn't come the same way. She hesitated, then agreed, slipping on a worn cardigan and stepping out into the cool evening air with me. We walked shoulder to shoulder, unforced, without grip on the past. The summer breeze carried faint laughter from a nearby stoop, and the faint smell of jasmine from someone's worn planter filled the street. I felt full, as though every step forward was a thread binding our stories anew. As we reached the stoop at 66th, I looked at her and saw the reflection of all we'd endured: war, separation, survival. But now, something else glowed in her eyes: possibility. I said softly, "You don't have to let me in tonight, but I hope you'll let me stay a little while longer." She looked at me, measured the words, and then opened her mouth in a small smile, saying, "Stay as long as you like." I nodded, both relieved and aware of the weight of our shared future. We stayed there in the gentle hush of the evening, where streetlights met shadow, where two people who once parted finally learned how to arrive. And as we talked quietly under the amber glow, I told her about my hopes of finding work near here, of writing again, of maybe finding a small apartment so I could be close. She told me about her dreams of opening a bookstore in the neighborhood, and we discovered that even after decades apart, when we stopped trying to reclaim exactly what was lost and instead honored the lives we built, we could find a new beginning together. When the morning light crept through the sheer curtains of her guest room, it painted delicate lines across the floor, lines that reminded me of the maps we used in the service, routes and borders that looked simple on paper but were anything but in reality. I lay there for a while on top of the blanket, listening to the subtle creaks of the brownstone waking up around me, the radiators sighing, the birds settling on the ledge, the low hum of the city revving into motion just beyond the window. I hadn't planned to sleep here. I hadn't expected to stay. But after we returned from our walk the night before, Rosa had turned to me and said, "You look tired. Stay." And I had. Not because I needed rest, but because her voice made something in me unclench that I hadn't realized I'd been holding for decades. I sat up slowly, taking in the room. Nothing extravagant. A bookshelf of paperbacks, a framed photograph of her parents, a vase with slightly wilted daffodils. But it felt more like home than anywhere I'd been since the war. I rubbed my temples, letting the silence wrap around me like a balm. The years had taught me that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks or certainty. Sometimes it returns like this, quietly, tentatively, asking nothing but to be seen and allowed back in. Downstairs, I heard the kettle whistle faintly. I walked to the kitchen where Rosa stood barefoot, her robe wrapped tightly around her, watching the water boil like it held the answers we hadn't yet spoken. She glanced at me and offered a soft smile. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded. She poured. We sat, and for a few minutes said nothing. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd said the day before, everything we didn't need to repeat. "I don't expect anything," I finally said, breaking the quiet. "Not a second chance, not a do-over. I just wanted to know you were okay, that I didn't imagine it all." She turned to me slowly. "You didn't," she said. "And you're here. That has to mean something." And it did. It meant everything. We spent the morning side by side, she watering plants, me helping repair a loose shutter on the back porch. The work was simple, grounding, the kind of thing we never got to do together all those years ago. Every movement was a thread mending something torn. She hummed as she moved, not a song I recognized, but something sweet and familiar. I joined in after a while, letting the melody carry us. Later, she pulled out a small box from the hallway closet. "I want you to see this," she said. Inside were photographs, letters, a few dried flowers, and tucked beneath them, a stack of my old letters. "They came back," she explained, "returned to sender. Some never even opened." My chest tightened as I picked them up, recognizing the handwriting, the stamps, the yellowing edges. I had assumed they were gone, lost to the void of war. But here they were, fragile proof that I had tried to stay connected. "I read them anyway," she added, "eventually." We sat on the couch together, flipping through the pieces of our interrupted story. Some pages made us laugh, my terrible poetry, my absurd descriptions of camp food, while others brought tears. The one I wrote after my best friend was killed, the one where I confessed I couldn't imagine a future without her. She leaned her head gently on my shoulder and whispered, "You were still with me, even when you weren't." I felt something shift inside, a peace, maybe, a quiet kind of redemption. In the afternoon, we walked again, this time through Central Park, where the spring air smelled of tulips and fresh grass, and street musicians played old standards near the Bethesda fountain. We sat on a bench and listened, letting the music wash over us, a score for a love that never quite died. I looked over at her, and she at me, And in that gaze I found not just affection, but understanding, a shared knowledge of what it means to lose time and to still be brave enough to show up for what remains. I told her I was thinking of staying in the city for a while. Not forever, I said, just long enough to remember how it feels to belong somewhere. She smiled and said, "Then let it be here." The sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the skyline, and I knew something in me had changed. Not because everything had been fixed, but because something had finally been faced. I had come back. She had opened the door, and together we had stepped into something new. Not everything broken gets repaired. Some cracks stay, but sometimes they let the light in. I leaned back in the softly cushioned armchair by the living room window, watching the last rays of sunlight reflect off the glass and illuminate the motes of dust dancing in the gentle breeze. And in that quiet moment, I felt for the first time in decades that everything I'd lost, the letters, the nights of waiting, the war-torn silence, had led me here, to this fragile peace shared with Rosa, who now sat across from me, the warmth of her presence as real and comforting as any home I'd ever known. And as I traced the faint gold rim of my coffee cup, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift isn't reclaiming what was, but discovering what still can be. I thought of the trenching mud of Monte Cassino, how cold and endless it felt beneath my knees, and how the memory of her floral bandana in my mind became a strange source of hope amid chaos, as though a thread of destiny had connected us across time and geography. And now, after stepping through the wrong door and finding her here, rooted in this familiar neighborhood on the Upper East Side, I understood that love is not always a grand, decisive gesture. It can be a quiet return, a steady presence, a promise renewed in soft shared mornings and daily routines that nonetheless mean everything when survival and connection are hard-won. We sat together as dusk deepened into night, the city lights below flickering to life one by one, each window telling a story of another life going on. A reminder that our story is just one among thousands in this vast place. Yet in this house, under these lights, our story feels vital, a testament to time's mercy and memory's endurance. I remembered the envelope I clutched all those years, unread, unsigned, but now I realized that its purpose was fulfilled not when I left it at her doorstep, but when it brought me back, bearing the weight of hope and an unspoken question. Would she open her heart again? She reached for my hand across the small table between us. Simple touch, quiet reassurance. No sweeping declarations. No promise to return to what was, because some things can't be restored without breaking. Instead, she and I were forming something new, shaped by years apart, by grief, by the scars that remained, not hidden, but acknowledged and honored. In her eyes, I saw the resilience of a life rebuilt, the courage to love beyond absence, and I felt in my own chest the embers of a love that had never truly extinguished. The room held the scent of coffee beans and old leather books, reminders that some things last longer than heartbreak. I felt a soft joy, not loud but strong enough to settle deep in my bones. I thought of the legacy of our time apart, my letters returned, weathered and unopened, yet still carrying my voice, her patience, her determination not to forget me, the life she built with courage even when I was gone. These weren't regrets. They were lifelines connecting us now, forming a bridge between history and possibility. I realized at that moment that our journey, mine from the ravages of war and hers through years of silence, had brought us not back to a past we couldn't reclaim, but into an ordinary evening made extraordinary simply because we were together, awake to one another, present. We didn't need dramatic words or elaborate gestures. We only needed to breathe in the same air, sit side by side, and say what couldn't fit on any letter, "I am here now." The city's distant hum reminded me that life goes on, and that is not a threat, but an invitation. An invitation to walk new streets with her, to learn her rhythms, to respect the chapters we each wrote separately, and to let this chapter unfold gently, with gratitude and hope. I thought, maybe this is what memory was meant for, not to trap us in yesterday, but to guide us to tomorrow. I lifted my gaze and met her eyes, brimming with unshed tears and quiet steadiness. I nodded, and she nodded back, a small sacred communion. It spoke louder than any vow. Let's keep going. If this story has touched your heart as it touched mine, please like and subscribe. It helps us continue sharing real stories that move, inspire, and remind us all that even when everything changes, what matters most can still be found. And now, more than ever, we'll continue telling new stories every single day. Stories of love, loss, resilience, and hope. Thank you for coming along with us.